The golden light from the massive chandeliers spilled across the ballroom floor, making everything sparkle. It was the kind of sparkle that money bought. The room was filled with people wearing designer suits and expensive jewelry, laughing at jokes that weren't funny and drinking wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The air smelled like expensive perfume, fresh flowers, and the faint scent of anxiety coming from the waitstaff weaving through the crowd. Elena stood near the wall, adjusting the tight black apron around her waist. She let out a small, silent sigh and picked up a heavy silver tray loaded with glasses of champagne. Her feet were already throbbing inside her uncomfortable black shoes, but she couldn't stop. She had a tuition bill due in 2 weeks, and this private gala was the only way she was going to make the payment. She wasn't here for the glamour or the free food, she was here for the paycheck. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, which was exactly how the guests seemed to prefer it. They would reach out, take a glass, and look right through her as if she were part of the furniture. To them, she was just a uniform, a pair of hands serving drinks. But Elena had a secret that none of them knew. Underneath the uniform, underneath the tired eyes and the sore feet, she was a genius. She was a pianist who could make the keys weep or sing with just a touch, but tonight, she was just the help. In the far corner of the large ballroom, standing alone like a dark, beautiful statue, was a concert grand piano. It was polished to a shine, reflecting the golden lights of the room. A jazz band had been playing on a small stage near the piano all evening, but they had just finished a song and were taking a break. The drummer was wiping his forehead, and the saxophone player was stepping outside for a smoke. The piano sat there, silent and waiting. Elena couldn't take her eyes off it. As she walked past a group of men talking about stock prices, her fingers twitched at her side. She knew exactly what that piano felt like. She knew the weight of the keys and the way the notes would ring out in a room with such high ceilings. She closed her eyes for a split second and let her mind drift away. She imagined walking over there, sitting on the bench, and letting her hands fly across the ivory. She imagined playing something so complex and beautiful that the noise in the room would stop. "Hey, watch it!" A sharp voice snapped, bringing her back to reality. Elena opened her eyes quickly and stepped aside just in time to avoid a tall woman in a sparkly blue dress. The woman didn't even apologize, she just huffed and adjusted her shawl, glaring at Elena as if the young waitress had personally offended her by existing in her path. "Sorry, ma'am," Elena said softly, keeping her head down. It wasn't a sincere apology, but it was the one she was paid to give. She moved on, circulating through the room. She offered drinks to a young couple who were too busy staring into each other's eyes to notice her. She placed a fresh napkin under an older man's drink who grunted in approval without looking up. The noise in the room was rising again. The band was gone, but the guests were loud. Glasses clinked, laughter roared, and the hum of 100 separate conversations filled the air. It was a chaotic noise, lacking any rhythm or harmony. It made Elena's skin itch. She was a person who lived for music. She heard rhythms in the way people walked and melodies in the rain against the window. This room, filled with the wealthiest people in the city, felt empty to her. It was all surface. It was all shine with no substance. She remembered the conservatory. It was a world away from this place. At school, she was respected. Her professors told her she had a gift, a rare ability to convey emotion through music that couldn't be taught. But talent didn't pay the rent. Talent didn't buy textbooks. So here she was, hiding her light under a bushel, serving people who wouldn't know the difference between a C major chord and a hole in the wall. As she rounded a large pillar, she found herself closer to the piano than she had been all night. Up close, it looked even more magnificent. The lid was open, showing the strings inside. The black surface was perfect, without a single fingerprint. Elena looked around. The servers were busy, and the guests were clustered in groups near the buffet and the bar. For a moment, the corner was quiet. Her heart beat a little faster. She had a crazy urge. She wanted to touch just one key. Just one. Just to hear the sound. It would take less than a second. She took a tiny step toward the bench, her tray of glasses still balanced steadily in her left hand. She was inches away. She could smell the wood polish. "You look like you're thinking about stealing that thing," a voice said from behind her. Elena froze. She turned around to see the bartender, an older man with kind eyes and a gray mustache. He was polishing a glass and smiling at her. "I wasn't going to steal it," Elena said, feeling her face get hot. "I was just looking." "It's a beauty, isn't it?" the bartender said, leaning against his station. "A Steinway Model D, probably worth more than this whole building. Shame they use it for background noise." "I know," Elena whispered. "I think it's lonely." The bartender laughed softly. "You musicians are all the same. You see feelings in everything. You play." Elena hesitated. She didn't like talking about it here. "A little. I used to play a lot." "Well, don't let the boss catch you touching it," he warned, but his tone was gentle. "He thinks the staff has cooties or something. Get back to the wolves, kid. They're getting thirsty." Elena nodded, tearing her gaze away from the piano. She took a deep breath and pasted her professional smile back on her face. "Thanks." She turned and walked back into the crowd. The air felt thicker here, harder to breathe. She passed a woman complaining about the temperature of the room. She passed a man bragging about the size of his new boat. She felt small again. She felt invisible. But the piano was still there in the back of her mind. It was a physical pull, like a magnet. She could feel the music building up inside her chest, trapped and begging to get out. She had spent years training her hands to do incredible things, and now they were only good for carrying silver trays. Suddenly, the main doors at the entrance swung open with a loud bang that didn't sound like an entrance. It sounded like a warning. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. A man walked in, surrounded by 3 other men in suits. He didn't walk, he strutted. He wore a tuxedo that looked like it cost a fortune, but he wore it with an aggressive arrogance that made him look dangerous. He wasn't here to enjoy the party. He was here to take it over. Elena watched from the edge of the crowd. She didn't know who he was, but she could feel the negative energy rolling off him in waves. This was the kind of man who saw the world as a game he was winning, and everyone else was just a pawn on his board. She clutched her tray tighter. She had a bad feeling about the rest of the night. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. She still had 3 hours left of her shift. As the new guest made his way toward the center of the room, shaking hands loudly and laughing too boisterously, Elena looked back at the piano one last time. It sat silent in the corner. It was waiting. And deep down, Elena knew that before the night was over, someone was going to have to play it. She just hoped it wouldn't be her, because she knew if she started, she wouldn't be able to stop until she had turned this whole fake party upside down. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and moved forward to serve the next drink, unaware that her quiet life was about to collide with the chaos of the millionaire's world. The silence of the piano was heavy, but the storm was just beginning to brew. The atmosphere in the ballroom changed the moment the man in the expensive tuxedo decided he was the center of the universe. His name was Mr. Sterling, a man who had made billions in real estate by being louder and more aggressive than anyone else. He wasn't just rich, he was loud. He carried his money like a weapon, using it to push people around. When he laughed, it sounded like a bark, sharp and sudden, demanding that everyone look at him and agree that he was the funniest man in the room. Elena watched him from a safe distance, standing behind a tall floral arrangement. She had seen his type before. Men who treated the world like a giant vending machine, put money in, get whatever you want out. He was surrounded by a group of younger men, all wearing suits that cost as much as Elena's car, hanging on his every word. They laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, nodding their heads like plastic dogs on car dashboards. It was embarrassing to watch, but Elena couldn't look away. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. As the night went on, Mr. Sterling got louder. The alcohol was flowing freely, and his face was getting red. He started waving his arms around as he talked, nearly knocking over a sculpture on a pedestal. The staff members were terrified of him. Elena saw one waiter accidentally step in his path. Mr. Sterling didn't say excuse me. He didn't even apologize. He just shoved the waiter out of the way with a heavy hand, spilling a tray of soda water on the floor. The waiter scrambled to clean it up, his face pale with panic, while Mr. Sterling didn't even break his sentence. Elena felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew that eventually, she would have to go over there. Her section included the tables near the center of the room, right where Mr. Sterling had decided to hold court. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and picked up a fresh bottle of champagne. She tried to make herself invisible. She tried to look like just another piece of the furniture. She approached the table where Mr. Sterling was holding court. The men were busy talking about a golf game they had played earlier, arguing loudly about who had the better swing. Elena moved quietly around the edge of the table, reaching out to top up a glass that was half empty. She was focused, her eyes on the glass, trying to be as quick and silent as possible. Suddenly, a heavy hand clamped down on her wrist. It wasn't a gentle tap. It was a grip that hurt. "Hey!" Mr. Sterling shouted, his voice booming right next to her ear. Elena flinched, nearly dropping the bottle. The bubbles hissed inside the glass. She looked up to find his eyes staring into hers. They were bloodshot and mean. "I didn't say you could touch me," he sneered. He didn't let go of her wrist. "You waitresses are all the same. You think you can just sneak up on people and grab them. You trying to steal my watch?" The table went quiet. The other men stopped laughing. They looked at Elena, then at Mr. Sterling, waiting to see how this would play out. It was a game to them. Entertainment. I was just refilling your glass, sir," Elena said softly. Her voice trembled, but she tried to keep it steady. "I wasn't touching you." Mr. Sterling squeezed her wrist harder, twisting it slightly. It was painful, but Elena refused to cry out in front of all these people. She bit her lip. "Don't lie to me," he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "I know what I felt. You people have sticky fingers. You see something shiny, you want to take it?" He finally let go of her wrist, shoving her hand away. Elena pulled her arm back, rubbing the sore spot where his fingers had been. Her face burned with embarrassment. She could feel 20 pairs of eyes on her. the humiliation washed over her like a bucket of ice water. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. "Now get out of here," Mr. Sterling waved his hand at her dismissively, like she was a fly bothering his dinner. "And bring me another bottle. And try not to assault me this time." The men at the table roared with laughter. It was a cruel, mocking sound. Elena felt tears stinging the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She turned around quickly and walked away, her head down. She went back to the service station, her hands shaking so badly she had trouble putting the bottle down. The bartender looked at her, his face full of concern. He saw the red marks on her wrist. "You okay?" he asked softly. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. She grabbed a fresh bottle of the expensive champagne. She wanted to quit. She wanted to walk out the door and never come back. But she needed the money. She needed the tuition payment. She thought of the empty fridge in her apartment and the stack of bills on her kitchen counter. She couldn't afford to stand up for herself. She had to take it. She took a few deep breaths, calming her racing heart. She thought of the music. She thought of the piano sitting in the corner, quiet and dignified. Be like the piano, she told herself. Strong. Silent. She turned back around and walked toward the table again. This time, she didn't try to be invisible. She walked with her back straight, her chin up. She was a waitress, yes, but she was a human being. She had dignity, even if Mr. Sterling couldn't see it. She reached the table. Mr. Sterling was in the middle of a story about firing someone who had looked at him the wrong way. He stopped mid-sentence as Elena stepped up to him. "Your champagne, sir," she said. Her voice was clear and loud enough for the whole table to hear. She didn't look at his eyes, she looked at his shoulder. Mr. Sterling looked at her, surprised by her tone. He picked up the glass, swirled the liquid around, and then without warning he tipped his hand over. The golden liquid splashed all over the white tablecloth and onto Elena's uniform. It soaked her black apron and dripped onto her shoes. It was a complete waste of expensive wine, but that wasn't the point. The point was the mess. The point was the humiliation. "Oops," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dripping with fake innocence. "Clumsy me. Or maybe it was your hand that slipped again. You really need to be more careful." The table exploded into laughter again. They laughed at the sight of her standing there, dripping wet. Elena stood frozen. She could feel the cold, sticky champagne seeping through her clothes. The smell of alcohol was overwhelming. She looked down at the mess. She looked at the red stain spreading on the tablecloth. Then, slowly, she looked up at Mr. Sterling. For a second, their eyes locked. She saw something in his face: anticipation. He wanted her to get angry. He wanted her to yell or cry. He wanted to prove that she was just an emotional girl who couldn't handle the high-stakes world of the rich. But Elena didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stared at him. It was a look that wasn't angry, but it wasn't weak either. It was a look that said, "I see you. And I pity you." The silence stretched between them. The laughter at the table died down awkwardly. Mr. Sterling shifted in his seat. For the first time that night, he looked uncomfortable. Her calmness was unnerving him. He was used to people reacting to his power. He wasn't used to someone standing their ground in silence. Finally, he cleared his throat loudly. "Well, are you going to clean this up, or just stand there dripping on my shoes?" Elena blinked. The spell broke. She reached for the napkin on the table. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice quiet again. "Right away." She began to wipe up the mess. The other men went back to their conversations, but the energy was different now. They were stealing glances at her. They knew what had happened wasn't right. They knew Mr. Sterling was being a bully. But none of them said a word. In this world, money bought silence. As Elena dabbed at the tablecloth, she caught sight of the piano again. It was still sitting there in the corner, untouched. It seemed to be calling to her, promising her a way out of this mess. She felt a spark of anger deep down in her chest. It wasn't a hot, violent anger. It was a cold, hard anger. It was the kind of anger that fuels great music. Mr. Sterling took a sip of his fresh glass of wine, smacking his lips loudly. He turned back to his friends, feeling like he had won. He had shown the waitress her place. He had proved that he was the king of this room. He had no idea that he had just woken up a giant. He had no idea that the quiet girl wiping wine off his table was about to change the course of the entire evening. He thought he was the main character, but he was just the villain in someone else's story. And the best part about villains is that they always get what they deserve in the end. Elena finished cleaning the mess. She picked up the dirty napkins and turned to leave. As she walked away, she didn't feel small anymore. She felt a strange sense of calm. She knew what she had to do. It wasn't a plan yet, but it was a feeling. And in her world, feelings always turned into music. The sticky feeling of the champagne was starting to dry on Elena's apron, making the fabric pull uncomfortably against her skin. She had retreated to the far side of the ballroom, trying to put as much distance between herself and Mr. Sterling as possible. The air near the bar was cooler, and the noise of the party was a dull roar from here. She leaned against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes and taking a deep, shaky breath. She wanted to go home. She wanted to take a shower and wash off the night, but looking at her watch, she realized she still had 2 hours left on her shift. 2 more hours of smiling, serving, and being invisible. She pushed herself off the wall and picked up a clean tray. She couldn't let him win. If she left now, she would be letting a bully chase her away from her livelihood. She squared her shoulders and walked back toward the main floor. As she moved through the crowd, she found herself drifting closer to the grand piano again. It was a strange pull, like gravity. The jazz band had completely packed up now, leaving the instrument alone in the spotlight. It looked lonely, sitting there in the middle of all the noise and chaos. It was a piece of art in a room full of pretenders. Elena stopped near a small cocktail table to adjust a napkin. She was standing right next to the piano bench. Without thinking, she reached out and let her fingers trail over the smooth, black wood of the piano's lid. It was cool to the touch, solid and reassuring. In her mind, she was hearing the opening notes of a Beethoven sonata, imagining the vibration of the strings under her hands. For a second, the smell of stale beer and expensive perfume faded away, replaced by the memory of dust motes dancing in a sunbeam at the conservatory. Well, well, well. What do we have here? The voice was like sandpaper scraping against glass. Elena froze and pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. She turned around to see Mr. Sterling standing just a few feet away. He had a fresh glass of whiskey in his hand and his entourage of sycophants was trailing behind him like lost puppies. He was swaying slightly, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy red. He was looking at her with a crooked, nasty smile. "I saw that," he said, pointing a finger at her. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. You were touching the merchandise. You think you're good enough to touch that instrument? Elena gripped her tray tight. I was just straightening the area, sir. I wasn't playing it. Don't lie to me, Mr. Sterling slurred slightly. He turned to his friends, raising his voice so the people standing nearby could hear. Look at this. The waitress thinks she's a concert pianist. She thinks she's some kind of artist. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. People were starting to turn and watch. Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She just wanted to disappear. She tried to step away, to move back to the safety of the kitchen, but Mr. Sterling stepped into her path, blocking her way. Hold on, he said, his eyes gleaming with malice. I'm curious now. You spend all night looking at this thing. You've got grease on your fingers and wine on your dress. Do you even know what that piano is? It's a Steinway. It costs more than your life. He laughed at his own cruel joke. His friends laughed too, but their eyes were shifting around uncomfortably. They could sense that this was crossing a line, but no one had the courage to tell him to stop. Tell you what, Mr. Sterling said, setting his glass down on a nearby table with a loud clink. Since you ruined my napkin earlier and spilled wine all over my table, I think you owe me. I think you owe all of us some entertainment. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. It was a mix of $100 bills, held together by a gold money clip. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he held it up high, letting the light catch the green paper. Let's make a deal, he announced to the room, projecting his voice like a ringmaster. If the little waitress can sit down and play us a song, a real song, not Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, I'll give her this cash. Right here, right now. The room went silent. The chatter died down. Everyone was looking at Elena. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks. It was a setup. She knew it. He didn't think she could play. He expected her to stumble through a clumsy, elementary tune so he could laugh at her. He wanted to turn her into a circus animal, dancing for a treat. The money wasn't a reward, it was a trap to humiliate her even further. What's the matter, Mr. Sterling taunted, waving the money in her face. Cat got your tongue, or maybe you realize you can't actually play, maybe you just like looking at things you can't have. He laughed again, a harsh, barking sound. He bent down and dropped the money onto the floor. It landed right near the polished pedals of the grand piano. He placed his shoe on top of it. There it is, he said, sneering. Crawl on the floor and pick it up if you want it. Or sit down and play something that proves you deserve to be in the same room as this piano. Elena looked down at the money. Then she looked up at Mr. Sterling. His face was twisted with arrogance. He thought he owned the moment. He thought he owned her. He was waiting for her to cry, or to apologize, or to scurry away in shame. He was expecting submission. But as Elena looked at him, something inside her shifted. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. She realized that no amount of money was worth her dignity, but playing the piano that was worth everything. The piano was her voice. It was the one place where she wasn't a waitress, she wasn't poor, and she wasn't invisible. On that bench, she was a queen. She didn't look at the money on the floor. She didn't look at the shocked faces of the guests. She looked directly into Mr. Sterling's eyes. Her gaze was steady and unblinking. Move, she said softly. Mr. Sterling blinked, caught off guard by her tone. What? Move your foot, she said, her voice dropping an octave, calm and strong. She didn't wait for him to listen. She took a step forward, forcing him to take a step back or be walked over. For a second, he looked confused, like a dog that had been barked at. He lifted his foot off the money and stepped aside, his arrogance faltering for the first time. Elena stepped past him, leaving the cash lying dirty on the floor. She walked over to the piano bench. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerators behind the bar. She set her tray down on a nearby chair with deliberate care. Then, she sat down on the bench. It felt familiar. The bench was hard, the height was perfect. She reached out and adjusted the microphone slightly. She could feel the eyes of 100 people burning into her back. She could feel Mr. Sterling standing just behind her, waiting for her to fail. He wanted a joke. He wanted a fool. Elena closed her eyes for a brief second. She let her hands hover over the keys. She wasn't going to play a pop song. She wasn't going to play something simple to please them. She was going to play something hard. She was going to play something that required every ounce of skill she had learned over 15 years of grueling practice. She visualized the notes. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the tension of the room. She opened her eyes and looked at the black and white keys. They weren't intimidating anymore. They were her soldiers. They were waiting for her command. Mr. Sterling leaned against the piano, crossing his arms. "All right, let's hear it. Don't bore us." Elena didn't acknowledge him. She didn't nod or smile. She just placed her left hand on the low keys and her right hand high above the keyboard. She was ready. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick, until it felt like the air might crack. Then, she brought her hands down. The sound that exploded from the piano wasn't a soft, polite tune meant to blend into the background. It was a thunderclap. Elena struck the keys with a force that sent a vibration through the floorboards, rattling the glasses on the nearby tables. The first chord was huge, angry, and full of power. It cut through the laughter and the chatter like a sharp knife through silk, instantly silencing a group of men standing near the bar who had been discussing a golf game. For the first few seconds, the room was too shocked to react. People turned their heads toward the noise, expecting to hear a fumble, a wrong note, or a childish nursery rhyme. That was what Mr. Sterling had set them up to expect. They were ready to cringe or to laugh at the help making a fool of herself. But as the sound hung in the air, echoing off the high ceilings, nobody laughed. It was clear immediately that this was not a joke. This was something else entirely. Elena didn't wait for the room to settle. She launched into the piece with a speed and precision that was terrifying. Her fingers were a blur, flying across the ivory keys with a life of their own. She played a complex, classical piece that was full of sharp turns and crashing lows. It wasn't background music, it was a musical story, and it was demanding that everyone stop and listen. Mr. Sterling, who had been leaning against the piano with a smirk on his face, straightened up abruptly. The smirk vanished. He stared at Elena's hands, his eyes wide. He looked back at his friends, expecting them to be smirking too, but they weren't. Their mouths were slightly open. They were looking at the piano, then at the waitress, completely confused. The atmosphere in the room shifted in a heartbeat. The cruelty of the moment before was replaced by a sudden, intense curiosity. The music was like a storm. It swept through the ballroom, washing away the fake atmosphere of the party. The waiters stopped moving. The bartenders stopped pouring. Even the band members, who were packing their instruments in the corner, stopped to watch. A silence began to spread outward from the piano, like a ripple in a pond. It started in the center and moved until it reached the walls. It became so quiet that the only sound in the entire hall was the frantic, beautiful pounding of the piano keys. Elena didn't see any of this. Her eyes were closed, her head bowed slightly over the keys. She wasn't in a ballroom anymore. She wasn't wearing a sticky apron. She was back in her practice room at the conservatory, safe and alone. She was pouring all her frustration, her tiredness, and her anger into the music. Every time Mr. Sterling had mocked her, every time she had been looked down on, every time she had to skip a meal to pay rent, it all flowed out of her fingertips and into the strings. The music was her revenge, but it was a beautiful, elegant revenge. It was a shout that didn't need words. The piece she played was incredibly difficult. It required jumps from one end of the keyboard to the other, demanding strength in the left hand and delicate grace in the right. A normal pianist would have been sweating, terrified of making a mistake. But Elena played with a terrifying confidence. She hit every note perfectly. The melody was like a siren's song, soaring high and dipping low, dragging the emotions of the listeners along with it. People who had been ignoring her all night were now captivated. A woman in a diamond necklace lowered her phone, forgetting to take a picture. A man who had been complaining about the service stood transfixed, his drink forgotten in his hand. They were realizing, one by one, that the girl they had treated like a ghost was a genius. The class barrier that had separated them all night, the line between the important guests and the invisible staff, was dissolving in the face of her talent. Music doesn't care about money. Music doesn't care about titles. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was the sound, and Elena was the master of it. Mr. Sterling shifted his weight uncomfortably. He looked small now. He tried to catch the eye of one of his friends to make a joke, but no one was looking at him. He realized he had lost the room. He had tried to make a fool of her, but instead, he had handed her a microphone, and she was using it to deafen him. The power dynamic had flipped completely. He wasn't the king anymore, he was just a spectator in the audience, watching a greatness he couldn't understand and certainly couldn't afford to own. The music changed pace. It moved from the loud, crashing thunder into a soft, delicate section. The notes were like raindrops on a roof, gentle and sad. Elena's touch became feather-light. The contrast was stunning. The room was holding its collective breath. You could hear the air conditioning humming in the silence between the notes. It felt like the entire world had stopped spinning to listen to this girl play. Elena's face was calm, peaceful even. A small sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead, glowing in the spotlight. She wasn't performing for Mr. Sterling anymore. She wasn't performing for the money. She was playing for herself. She was playing to prove to herself that she was still there, that her dream was still alive, and that a rich man's cruelty couldn't touch her soul. The physical exertion was intense. Her arms moved like pistons, her body swaying with the rhythm of the piece. She was attacking the piano, wrestling a masterpiece out of it. It was a raw, human display of power. It wasn't polished and boring like the rest of the gala. It was wild. It was real. And it was mesmerizing. The song began to build toward its climax. The notes got faster, climbing higher and higher, layering on top of each other in a whirlwind of sound. The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone felt it, even the people who knew nothing about music. They could feel the energy coming off the stage in waves. Elena slammed her foot onto the sustain pedal, holding it down as her hands raced to the final run. Mr. Sterling took a step back, actually intimidated by the intensity of the performance. He looked at the money still lying on the floor near his shoe. It looked pathetic now. It looked like trash compared to the wealth of sound filling the room. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he had made a terrible mistake. He had tried to break someone, but he had only made them stronger. Elena's hands flew across the final octave. She played the last chord with every ounce of strength she had left. She slammed the keys, her arms lifting high in the air as the final note rang out loud, deep, and resonant. Bam! She pulled her hands away instantly. The sound vibrated through the room, echoing off the walls, slowly fading away into nothingness. Elena sat there, frozen, her chest heaving. She kept her hands suspended in the air for a moment, letting the silence take over. The quiet that followed was heavier than the noise had been. It wasn't an empty silence, it was a holy silence. It was the kind of silence you hear in a church after a prayer, or in a forest after a storm passes. For 10 long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mr. Sterling stood with his mouth open, his face red. The guests were staring at the stage, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of pure disbelief. The waitress had stopped the party. She had silenced the millionaires. And in the quiet of the ballroom, everyone knew that something incredible had just happened. The silence that filled the ballroom was heavy, almost like a physical weight that pressed down on everyone's shoulders. The final vibration of the piano string had faded into nothingness, but the ghost of the sound still hung in the air. It was the kind of quiet that only happens when something truly profound has just occurred, when the human mind is too busy processing what it heard to make a noise. Elena sat on the bench, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her hands were resting lightly on her knees, trembling slightly from the adrenaline rushing through her veins. For a long moment, she kept her eyes closed, not wanting to come back to reality. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she was safe. She was just a musician. But she knew she couldn't stay there forever. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The spotlight was bright, blinding her a little, but she could see the shapes of people standing in the semi-darkness. At first, nobody moved. It was as if they were all statues frozen in time. Mr. Sterling was still standing near the curve of the piano, his mouth slightly open, his glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. He looked smaller than before, his arrogance stripped away by the sheer power of what he had just witnessed. Then, a single sound broke the quiet. It was the sharp crack of hands clapping together. It came from an older man standing near the front, a distinguished guest with silver hair who had been quietly listening all night. He didn't clap politely, he clapped with force. He looked at the stage with a look of pure wonder. That single clap was like a spark in a dry forest. Immediately, another person joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the silence shattered. It wasn't just polite applause anymore. It was a roar. The room erupted in a wave of noise that was louder than the music had been. People started shouting bravo and encore. The guests, who only minutes ago had been treating Elena like she was invisible, were now on their feet, craning their necks to get a look at the girl in the waitress uniform. Elena stood up. She felt lightheaded, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked out at the sea of faces. They weren't looking through her anymore. They were seeing her. Really seeing her. It was a terrifying and overwhelming feeling. She gave a small, awkward nod. She wasn't a performer who knew how to take a bow, she was just a student who had poured her heart out. She turned to step off the small stage, but the crowd's noise only grew louder. A man in a tuxedo rushed forward, offering his hand to help her down the stairs. It was the same man who had been complaining about the temperature earlier. Now, he was looking at her with nothing but respect. That was incredible, he stammered, his eyes wide. Who are you? Elena just smiled a tired, humble smile and didn't answer. She wasn't interested in making connections now. She moved past him, her feet automatically carrying her back toward the service station. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. No one tried to stop her to ask for wine. No one ignored her. They stepped back, a path clearing through the expensive suits and glittering dresses. She had to walk right past Mr. Sterling to get back to the safety of the side wall. He was still standing by the piano, looking confused and angry. His face was bright red, but this time it wasn't from the alcohol, it was from humiliation. He watched Elena approaching, and for a second, he looked like he wanted to say something mean. He looked like he wanted to shout at her, to try and regain control of the situation. He opened his mouth, his lips twisting into a sneer. "Hey," he started, his voice loud but shaky. "You think you're..." But he didn't get to finish. No one was listening to him. The people around him had turned their backs. One of his own friends, a younger man he had been entertaining all night, actually walked away from him to follow Elena, trying to catch her eye to shake her hand. Mr. Sterling was left talking to the air. He looked at the money he had thrown on the floor earlier. It was still lying there, crumpled near the pedal. He looked at the dirty glass on the floor. In the light of the brilliance that had just filled the room, his cruelty looked cheap and pathetic. Elena walked past him without slowing down. She didn't look at him. She didn't glare at him, and she didn't smirk. She didn't give him the satisfaction of an acknowledgement. To her, he was no longer a threat. He was just a sad, noisy man who had tried to break something beautiful and failed. By ignoring him completely, she did more damage to his ego than any insult could have done. She treated him like the nothing he was. She finally made it back to the service station. She practically collapsed behind the bar, leaning heavily against the counter. The bartender was there, a huge grin on his face. He reached out and gently took the empty tray from her hands. "I knew it," he whispered, pouring her a glass of ice water from the tap. "I knew you had it in you. You shut them up, kid. You shut the whole room up." Elena took the water with both hands, her fingers still trembling. "I just wanted to play," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the noise of the room. "I just wanted them to be quiet for a minute." "Well, you did more than that," the bartender laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You just made every person in this room feel like an idiot for ignoring you." The manager of the event came rushing over, looking flustered. He was a man who usually cared only about the guests, but now he was looking at Elena with dollar signs in his eyes. He had seen how the guests reacted. "Elena." "That was unexpected," the manager said, adjusting his tie. "People are asking who you are. The host wants to meet you. This could be huge for the venue." "I'm just a waitress," Elena said, cutting him off. She took a long drink of the cold water. It felt amazing sliding down her dry throat. "I'm just doing my job." "You are not just anything," the manager insisted. "That was art." From across the room, the jazz band was returning to the stage. They looked tired and bored, unaware of what had just happened. Elena looked at them, then back at the piano. She knew she couldn't play again. She had given everything she had. The magic was gone for tonight. Now, she was just tired. She checked the clock on the wall. It was late. Her shift was almost over. Her feet hurt, her uniform was sticky with champagne, and her hands were sore. But for the first time in a long time, her heart felt light. The burden of the tuition bill, the worry about the rent, the stress of the insults, it all felt manageable now. She had proven something to herself. She had looked into the face of a man who thought he owned the world, and she had shown him that he didn't own talent. He couldn't buy it, and he couldn't control it. She stood up straight and fixed her apron. She didn't need a standing ovation to pay the rent, and she didn't need the approval of millionaires to feel good about herself. But it was nice to know that she could command the room whenever she wanted to. "I'm going to clock out," Elena told the manager, handing him the empty glass. "Are you sure there are people who want to tip you?" the manager said, looking disappointed. "I'm sure," she said. "I have class in the morning." She walked toward the kitchen, pushing through the swinging doors that separated the front of the house from the back. The noise of the party faded behind her, replaced by the clatter of dishes and the smell of leftover food. It was warm back here, and it smelled like hard work. It smelled like home. As she untied her apron and hung it on her hook, she caught her reflection in a metal sheet pan. She looked messy. Her hair was falling out of its bun, and her makeup was smudged. But she smiled at her reflection. It was a real smile. Elena grabbed her bag and walked out the back door into the cool night air. The city was loud, horns honking in the distance, but she didn't mind. She walked down the street toward the subway station, her footsteps light. Inside the ballroom, the party was slowly starting back up. The music played, people drank, and they talked about the mystery waitress who had played like an angel. But Mr. Sterling was quiet. He sat in the corner, staring at his drink, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. The laughter was gone from his eyes. He realized that while he had the money to buy a piano, he would never have the power to make it sing like that. And miles away, on a subway train heading home, Elena sat with her eyes closed, humming the melody of the song she had played, carrying the music with her wherever she went. She was just a waitress to the world, but in her heart, she was a millionaire of the soul. And that was worth more than anything Mr. Sterling could ever put in a bank.